Life, lifestyle discussion designed to make your life more engaging, meaningful, and complete. Celebrating the baby boomer generation, this is Boomer Life on Sea Isle 650.
Music about the mind on Boomer Life. This would suggest perhaps a visit from the team from NeuroKinetics. Why? It's exactly what has happened. And welcome to the program. Sterling Fox joined in studio by Dr. Philippe Silvestre, the founder and president of NeuroKinetics Clinic in Vancouver. Good to see you again.
It's wonderful to be here.
And also joining us in studio, clinic manager Sonia Dale. Hello, welcome back.
Hello.
And J.C. Gordon is with us from NeuroKinetics. J.C. is Director of Liaison and Logistics. Welcome back, sir.
Pleasure, Sterling.
Good to have you with us. Today on the program, we're going to talk, it's about the mind, it's about the brain, and brain optimization is a familiar and favorite phrase at NeuroKinetics Clinic in Vancouver. But on the program today, we want to focus, and we have a visit from a former patient lined up on the agenda as well, but we want to focus on PTSD. So, Dr. Silvestre, by way of beginning a reasonable discussion of PTSD, please tell us what PTSD is. Really, we all think we know it is, but please tell us.
Yeah. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress syndrome. And it is too often banalized into a psychological condition, which is actually inappropriate and inadequate, considering the severity of these conditions and the lack of medical and therapeutic resources that are able to bring someone who is afflicted by such a syndrome back to normal lifestyle and performance.
So post-traumatic stress disorder. So the traumatic event has occurred in a person's life, and post that traumatic event, the person is so upset by what happened, life just isn't the same anymore.
Well, I wouldn't even say it's a matter of being upset. It is a matter of getting overwhelmed from a brain standpoint, and the brain will become dysfunctional.
Right. We used to, and I think, JC, we first sort of came to know the term post-traumatic stress disorder in the 80s when our soldiers were returning home from war zones. And we discovered that this phenomenon amongst serving military combatants was real, and the consequences were profound, weren't they?
They really were, and it just didn't begin in the 1980s when the veterans came back from the war. It's been going on since the beginning of time, that post-traumatic stress is from stress, and stress happens in a number of ways for every different individual.
Dr. Philippe, there are a lot of people who listen to Boomer Life here on Sea Isle who are boomers and who remember, as JC was just alluding to, previous conflicts, the Korean War, the Second World War. There were no medical terms attached to the psychological damage that was inflicted on those soldiers and sailors and airmen. When they came home, they were said to have shell shock.
Yes.
And various other, we gave descriptions for what was going on, but it really, in all of those events, in all of those occasions, it really was PTSD, wasn't it?
Well, PTSD is a medical definition of this particular condition, which is basically characterized by different grades of incapacitation,
right,
from a physical standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, from a cognitive standpoint, from an intellectual standpoint, and ended up in incapacitating those. I don't want to say patient, but incapacitating those individuals from an executive standpoint as well. So one of the severe grades of such a condition leads to freeze in front of something to do in a particular circumstances, a particular action.
Right. And Sonia, a lot of the people who are NeuroKinetics patients these days who are there for PTSD, they're not retired military people or former soldiers. A lot of them are first responders. We're finding out more and more in 2015 about firefighters and paramedics and police officers, people who are the first on the scene of horrific events sometimes, and the damage, psychological damage caused is profound again, isn't it?
It is. It's not just caused I mean, it's not something in effect that in someone's life that is experiencing, PTSD. It's also could be by witnessing it. Like you're saying, the first responders,
Sure.
police officers, firefighters, war veterans. We have they experience a lot of things or witness a lot of things that maybe we forget. We don't realize the stuff that they see day to day. Another thing could be, in schools. It could be teens, for example. The stress level in schools, there's the cool groups and then there's the not so cool groups, know, in schools. So it could be the stress of fitting in. It could be bullying. It could be, assaults. Many other things that are related. It's not just coming from being in first responders, for example.
Circumstances such as abuse or dysfunctional families would lead to this type of extreme conditions, and usually they are overlooked and denied.
What I wanted to ask you about, though, Doc, more than anything else, is the fact that we're hearing now from the wives, widows of former members of the RCMP, for example, who are asking the government of Canada to conduct a study because their husbands suffered PTSD and ended up killing themselves. They committed suicide. What is it about PTSD that causes such a dramatic event in a person's life where they're prepared to take their own lives?
Disconnect would be the capturing phenomenon, the core phenomenon. When you get insulated, isolated, disconnected with a reality toward which we are physiologically built up and made up to connect with, it's like you suppress all the five senses at once. In someone, you find yourself in a blank zone, totally without being capable to hear any noise, any visual meaning of what is around you. The touch is gone, this type of thing. You find yourself in a place which is unbearable.
Right.
And the only way out is to shorten that.
It's a phenomenon that is so profound, JC. And of course, and I was just talking about the widows of former Mounties, and there are dozens of them involved in this project. This is something, this PTSD business is not just about the individual who has suffered the traumatic event. It's about everyone in that individual's life, too, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely true. And I know even professional athletes have had post-traumatic stress, and even here in Vancouver, we had a number of years ago, we had an NHL hockey player who unfortunately took his own life, and I remember that summer there were actually 3 NHL hockey players that took their life who suffered from PTSD. It's a phenomenon that is out there and more rampant than we can even begin to believe.
Right. So, Sonia, when people call you, Sonia is the clinic manager and very frequently the first line of contact that we have with NeuroKinetics. And so when someone sends you an email or picks up the phone and calls and indicates that there's a likely PTSD scenario going on, do you encourage that person when they come into NeuroKinetics to bring family members with them?
Yes, most definitely.
Okay.
Generally with any condition, we do ask for, a loved one or family member or friend to come along with them, because they can also help recall a certain situation if they do forget, meaning the person that's coming in to get the care. If they don't remember or if they don't, recalling the certain situation may be very difficult, very emotional, and it's also a fear. It's also the danger of going back to that scenario and repeating it, whereas when they bring in a loved one or a partner or a friend, they can help with that situation and help us have a better understanding of how severe the condition is.
And I would imagine that on more than a few occasions, friends or particularly close family members who brought in the person with the post-traumatic stress disorder have learned enough about what's gone on in their person's life that they too benefit from the experience simply by getting to understand what's going on.
Yes, that's correct. I think it's also helping educate the family members and the friends and understanding that they're isolating themselves from the world for a reason.
Yeah.
If going out to, for example, getting into the car is traumatic for them, there's a reason behind it. If, for example, going into a party with other people is traumatizing to them, there's a reason behind that. We want them to realize it's not just, get over it now, it's been 10 years or 5 years. No, there's a reason. It takes time. We just are helping them, also educate them at the same time.
Well, and get over it, Philippe. You're an ex-military guy. You were a surgeon in the French Air Force. You know the military mindset, and there's a culture that says you're tough. You can handle this. You don't need any help. Tough guys don't need help. Tough guys just get through it. They suck it up and they get through it. And so there's the police, the same kind of close ranks, tough guys get it done kind of mentality that makes it even more difficult for individuals to reach out for help, doesn't it? It's not a good thing, that culture.
There is nothing more unrealistic than thinking like this.
Right. And yet it's widespread not just it's through the military culture the world over, isn't it?
I think it is a healthy side of things as a protective device psychologically to go through repetitively through difficult and challenging situations, sometimes life-threatening. But beside that, there's a reality which is the brain is or can be overwhelmed out of any act of will, and that will come in a snap under any circumstances. There is no way one can predict an occurrence of a PTSD. It does happen or it does not happen. It is unpredictable. And through my career, I have begun to understand the history of what is building up a condition towards creating a PTSD condition.
Right.
And the base is physiological. It is organic. Functionally organic.
Right.
Not talking about damage, but functionally dysfunctional, in short, compared to a purely psychological interpretation, which is totally unrealistic.
Interesting stuff. Our guests are from NeuroKinetics Clinic here in Vancouver. Our guests are Dr. Philippe Silvestre, Clinic Manager Sonia Dale. J.C. Gordon is with us, too. He's Director of Liaison and Logistics. And when I'm going to take a break now, but when we come back, we're going to carry on our conversation about post-traumatic stress disorder and what the people at NeuroKinetics do for patients who come to them with PTSD. And we're also going to hear from a patient who has been through the process. And we'll pick up that conversation in just a couple of minutes right here.
Canada's only weekly radio show dedicated to the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on CIL 650. Back. This is Boomer Life on CIL 650.
I would dance and be merry. Life would be a ding-a-dairy if I only had a brain.
Our producer is just having a field day on the program today. Dwayne Bishop at the controls with a little clip there from The Wizard of Oz, and If I Only Had a Brain. We're talking about the brain with our friends from NeuroKinetics Clinic in Vancouver. Dr. Philippe Silvestre is the clinic founder and president. Sonia Dale is the clinic manager. J.C. Gordon is director of liaison and logistics. Great to have you. And, of course, we just heard from Dorothy and her story. And it's interesting that I'm curious as to why, J.C., you selected Dorothy as an example of a PTSD patient, because we typically, and perhaps wrongly, associate the disorder with people who are police officers or soldiers, people who can experience violence in its many forms. And Dorothy doesn't have any of that in her background, and yet was clearly a person with PTSD. So an interesting choice of examples. Why did you do that?
Well, that's a great question, Sterling. And the reason why we did that is to let our listeners know that PTSD is just not pigeonholed to first responders. It's just not pigeonholed to soldiers.
Right.
It's out there. And Sonia was mentioning in the first segment that it happens in high schools with bullying. With I mentioned earlier as well that there are athletes that suffer from PTSD. It is out there everywhere. It is a disorder of stress.
Right.
And I, quite frankly, do not know one person alive today who does not suffer from stress. Everybody suffers from stress, and everybody has different levels of stress, and everybody takes it in a different way.
Right. Back to the doctor for an update on this, because I asked you at the beginning of the program, Philippe, what is PTSD? And you told us, but perhaps I should have asked you at that time. Belatedly, I catch up to you again and say, talk to us about the root causes of PTSD. What causes all this?
This is a very important question, as it takes us away from the usual interpretation of what is a PTSD, as seen too often as only a psychological condition.
Right.
It is much more than that. PTSD condition will combine physical symptoms, emotional symptoms, cognitive symptoms in terms of hypersensitivity, irritability, which has nothing to do with emotion, but rather being overwhelmed.
Right, sure.
And deteriorate from there, and leading to an executive incapacitation.
Okay.
We know too well that a PTSD patient too long in that state will lose his or her capability to work reliably.
And it becomes, as I understand the way the syndrome works, or the disorder works, putting the D in the proper spot there, Sonia, it can spiral downwards. It can, and isolation can be a byproduct of PTSD. One feels the need, as Philippe has just said, to isolate oneself from the world. You just turn your senses off. You don't want to know about what's going on out there.
And that is a paradigm shift in understanding the reality of what is a PTSD.
Right.
PTSD is due essentially to a physiological disorganization with respect to brain functionality.
Right.
It is not a psychological causation.
Right, and to our example, and that wonderful conversation we just had with Dorothy a few minutes ago, when someone calls the clinic, Sonia, generally you're there to take the call, yes. And someone, how do you know when someone calls NeuroKinetics and they express, do they just say, I think I've got PTSD, or what do they say?
No, they usually don't. It's listing out their symptoms, really. Main one being is fear.
Okay.
They're afraid to, pretty much walk into a clinic and be judged upon and say, this is this is your symptoms, this is your condition. And I think the fact that they have to face reality and say that this is what I'm diagnosed with is a main issue for some, and the judgment from society. PTSD really is major. It's looked down upon, I would say.
Yeah, well, it's there's that stigma attached to it, especially in the professional circles.
It's also, I would say, not putting any cultures or communities down. I've worked with many, communities and cultures, volunteer time as well, that they, in certain communities don't have a understanding for PTSD.
Right.
It's diagnosed as soon as someone they understand is a PTSD patient, they must go see a psychiatrist or they must go see a psychologist. It's not something that they feel is curable,
In Dorothy's case, she told us that she made the decision to go to NeuroKinetics, but it took her weeks after making up her mind to actually pull it off. Is that typical?
Yes, it is typical. And what we do, once I do receive the phone call or the email from potential patients or inquiry patients, calling in or emailing us in, it's narrowing down their symptoms, and at that point, working out what's comfortable for them.
Right.
In that case, if that means we have to set up a Skype consultation, as Dorothy mentioned, it took her several weeks before she even made the decision of coming in to see us. We are happy to do Skype. Whether you're in town or you're out of town, we are happy to arrange to do a Skype consultation with you, whatever is at the patient's comfort level. So if you're comfortable not leaving your house, but you also are reaching out and you want the help, we will be there too.
Right.
To speak to you.
Do people just call you sometimes? Again, there's a lot of frustration by this, because, JC, you've described NeuroKinetics as a destination of last resort for a lot of people who've been around the block too many times and received precious little satisfaction until they get to NeuroKinetics. And, oh, my gosh, people here listen to you. People here express hope and a desire to help and are willing to cooperate in that way. But when someone like Dorothy,
yes.
And others who are reluctant to engage, so that going that extra step and having the Skype the contact from a remote location, That's a smart move, because it would encourage someone housebound by their own design to at least be able to reach out.
It's speaking to them in their comfort zone,
Right.
in their comfort area. I mean, if they're comfortable at home, or if they're comfortable at a friend's house or anywhere, we're speaking to them where they would like to be spoken to. So, I mean, most cases, as we were talking about it before through the other segments, they isolate themselves from the rest of the world.
Oh,
so,
sure. Yeah. JC?
What Sonia is describing with the Skype initial complimentary introductory session that we do with all of our patients is what makes NeuroKinetics so unique, is that before we are going to do any level 1, level 2, or level 3 work, is we have this a complimentary introductory session either in person at our clinic, or as Sonia said, with Skype,
right,
for individuals to know, even before anything is started, if they feel comfortable with us, if they feel that we can help them, and to know what it is that they are going to have to do. And that's what we know we need to do with all our patients, is take the time to understand them. And that's really a strength of ours before we do anything.
And Dr. Philippe, when people come into the clinic, how many times have you had someone sit down and begin the conversation with, "Doctor, please tell me I'm not going crazy"?
It's constant. It is a motto.
I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised. As Sonia has explained to us in the past, people end up at NeuroKinetics because they've just run out of options, and all of a sudden it becomes obvious to them that there's another possibility here. But I've been around the block and I've not received a great deal of Doctor, please tell me I'm not going crazy.
Yeah, they all say that.
So is it because of the I don't want to say ambivalence of the medical system, but of the fact that they just haven't been understood clearly prior to seeing you?
Yes. You just said the core of it. Yes.
Okay.
I would also say that there unfortunately there's a greater symptom in play here, and that is the fact that there are so many people suffering from so many problems, and there is so limited amount of space, limited amount of help that is available,
right,
that people don't get the time that they really need. And I think that could be the greater underlying cause of people's health problems.
Well, typically, when you go see your family doctor for any reason, you're lucky to get 15 minutes. And then if you need a referral to a specialist, that you may get an appointment that'll last longer than 15 minutes, but you're going to have to wait up to 6 months to see that person. And then if you're lucky, you may get more than 15 minutes. Dr. Philippe, your first assessment typically lasts 3 hours.
Yes, 3 to 5 hours.
So
Depending on the complexity.
Well, there's the difference already.
Yeah.
It's just that simple. There's the dramatic difference right there.
I think I would like to interject about an observation I have done since I moved to this country in '95, and God knows how much I became a proud Canadian citizen here. I love this country. When I have the opportunity through my family or myself to need the medical care, as we all need once in a while, I have seen almost all the time a little piece of paper nailed down in a nice little frame on a wall in a waiting room, mentioning that the patient shouldn't expect to talk more than one symptom at a time, and if there is more than one symptom to be discussed, they have to book another appointment.
Oh my!
This is outstandingly wrong.
Well, it's you and your history of Western and Eastern medicines, and the career that you've spent integrating the two practices and modalities that leads to an even greater understanding of the need to spend time with people.
It's a time to listening. It takes time to listen. It takes time to think. It takes time to analyze and understand the complexity of a human being. We cannot reduce a condition down to a symptom, one at a time.
When we come back, we need to take a quick break here, but when we come back, we'll talk about the process at NeuroKinetics. The 3.5 hour interview? No. Well, not 1, but 3 minimum. And then, and only then, the therapy begins. Details after this time out.
Celebrating the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on CIAL 650. We're back. This is Boomer Life on CIAL 650.
There's a song called Tough Enough by the fabulous Thunderbirds as we return to Boomer Life here on CIL 650. Tough Enough is an interesting song for our producer, Dwayne Bishop, to have chosen because we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and some of the culture surrounding it. Dr. Philippe Souvestre is the president and founder of NeuroKinetics Clinic here in Vancouver. Sonia Dale and J.C. Gordon are also here from the clinic. Dr. Souvestre is a former flight surgeon with the French Air Force, has a military aspect to his career, and completely understands the culture surrounding PTSD and the denial existing within that culture. And Sonia reminded us during the break of something that this is far from exclusive to military or first responder applications. In the course of her career, Sonia has worked at women's shelters here in Metro Vancouver, and you told us a story about the culture, even there, to have admitted some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder in the confines of a women's shelter where you would expect a great deal of sympathy. There wasn't always sympathy forthcoming. Why?
The fact that it's looked down upon, I'm going to repeat that again, it's people generalize it as a fact that as soon as you're diagnosed or assume that you have PTSD, you're going to need a psychiatrist or a psychologist pretty much for the rest of your life. Like, there's completely something wrong with your brain. But the fact is, I mean, from my experiences working with, the women's shelter and working with many other community places that I've been through, they've experienced something or have been other assaulted. Like, for example, for the females that I've worked with, it was, sexual abuse, physical, domestic violence, as many call it. That can also lead to that. It's a fear of, many women have a fear of even, going back to another relationship. That's a huge fear. Getting married could be a huge fear. And people don't realize that. That's something that could also fall in the same umbrella here.
And Dr. Philippe, I promised earlier after we spoke with Dorothy that I was going to ask you how you do that, how you take a person with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, Dorothy she'd cut herself off from the world. She was hiding in the basement for months on end. So how did you get her out of her shell? Is it all about going back to the initial traumatic event and dealing with that and then coming forward from it?
Not at all.
Oh, okay. Tell us
Not
how you
at
do
all.
it.
That is done in psychology and psychiatry. No, it is not the right approach in my experience. And what I have learned in brain physiology shows me that whatever the nature of a trauma can be, whether from physical to emotional or cognitive, in terms of perceptuality or processing, like comparing this processing to software, animating the hardware of a computer, for example, comparing a human being to an organized, independent computer. In terms of performance and self-control, it is not at all of a psychological origin.
Okay. And I see the question, I framed the question even in a psychological point of reference, because that's the only reference point I understand.
And that is extremely common out there.
Okay.
And it doesn't reflect the real world.
Okay, so JC, walk us through the process. Someone with a post-traumatic stress disorder or other serious mental issue or some kind of traumatic event in their lives that has disoriented them or caused disruption in their lives ever since, decides, okay, already, I'm going to call NeuroKinetics. It's about time. I need some help. What happens?
Great question, Sterling. What we do at NeuroKinetics is optimize the brain. In other words, what we do at NeuroKinetics is evaluate dysfunction, determine if we are going to be able to reverse that dysfunction and get the brain back into its functional, normal self. And PTSD, yes, it is a side effect or a symptom of that dysfunction. And so at NeuroKinetics, the initial work that we do is the evaluation that is able to determine if what we do is going to be able to help.
Sure.
Because that initial evaluation, it's kind of like a pre and post, before the work that we do and after the work that we do.
Right.
And what we're able to do is to determine that, yes, we can help with that dysfunction, which in some cases has led to the PTSD.
Right. And Sonia, the evaluation, unlike that 15-minute, if you're lucky, visit to your physician, the evaluation, and Dr. Philippe has already talked to us about this, can go 3 to 5 hours, and there are an obligatory 3 evaluations before any treatment begins, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay,
so there's 3 assessments. Prior to the assessments, we do a 30 to 45-minute complimentary consultation.
Okay.
It's basically understanding their symptoms, their condition, and making them also feel comfortable with us prior to the actual treatments beginning.
Okay.
Getting familiar with Dr. Philippe, getting familiar with the clinic, with the rest of the staff, because that is also very important to us, that they also feel comfortable.
Okay, and sorry, Philippe.
And I would like to add up that getting also confident that the paradigm shift and the mindset are a fit for them.
Okay, and typically, what would a treatment program last for someone? Once you've done those multi-hour assessments and you've devised a program to restore this person to where he or she would like to be, thank you very much, typically how long would that program last?
It is a minimum of 12 weeks, and it is rarely excessing that duration, actually. So let's say between 12 to 16 weeks, most commonly.
Okay, so 3 or 4 months.
Correct.
And then is there an ongoing come back in for a tune-up kind of thing once a year, or
yeah?
Oh, okay. So you recommend maintaining some association?
Once a year, yes. Part of the reason for that is in a year a lot of things can happen.
Yes.
And also part of our ambulatory stimulative devices have a 1-year lifespan. So that is one of the parameters as well.
Okay, so in the course of the testing, Sonia, we've talked about this before, there's a series of tests in the first assessment visit, and the same tests, in fact, may be repeated in visits number 2 and 3, but they become a little more complicated each time.
Yes, that's right, yes.
And it's all about developing a baseline for that individual to build a program on, right?
Right, and it's also for us to recognize we have a pattern, basically, a 3-level assessment. We need to recognize the difference between the 3. So this is why we do the 3 of them. Customized treatment program begins right after the 3rd.
Okay, JC, someone listening here, and perhaps not themselves personally, but they know someone who has been literally in the dark for a good long time, having a terrible life, who could really benefit from the fine folks at NeuroKinetics, Dr. Philippe and his team, of which you are a part. How do they get in touch?
They can just simply go to our website, which is neurokinetics.com. They can contact us via the email at our website, or they can even call us.
Okay.
It's 604-736-3963.
Okay, and NeuroKinetics, by the way, is right in Vancouver. It's right there as you go up the big hill on Granville Street, heading out of downtown. It's the Highcroft Medical Building right there at Granville and 16th, 3195 Granville, I think, right, Sonia?
That is right,
okay.
Yes. I just want to add one more thing, that they can also, I know NeuroKinetics is a bit tricky, they can find us at renewme.ca.
Renewme.ca.
That's correct.
That's the alternate, that's the back door to the same website.
It is.
And NeuroKinetics, friends, just for your own edification, is NeuroKinetics.com. Check it out. It's a very, very worthwhile visit on the internet that you will pay. Dr. Silvestre, good to see you again. Sonia, thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you.
JC, always a pleasure.
Always my pleasure as well.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time right here on Boomer Life.
We're back. This is Boomer Life on CIL 650.
You better think about what you're trying to do to me.
We're talking about thinking this time around, are we? It's all about the brain when our friends from NeuroKinetics drop in for a visit here on Boomer Life. In studio, we have the president and founder of NeuroKinetics, Dr. Philippe Silvestre, clinic manager Sonia Dale, and JC Gordon, director of liaison and logistics. The trio is back with us in studio, but we're not done yet. We have another guest to join us. Dorothy is on the line from her home here in Metro Vancouver. Dorothy, thanks for joining us. You're a former patient of NeuroKinetics, correct?
That's correct, and it's my pleasure to be here.
Tell us a little bit give us a little bit of background. What kind of shape were you in when you heard about NeuroKinetics? Why did you end up there?
I had fallen into a very deep depression after 20 years working in a high stressful job and many, many layers of trauma underneath that I was somewhat unaware of. And I came to the point where I knew I was going to have to call my doctor and check myself into the hospital, and I thought, oh dear, I'm already on antidepressants. Do I want more medication, or can I find a slightly different way of finding this? And I was given the website address for NeuroKinetics, so I went online, looked it up, and went, I think this is more to my liking. So when I first came into the office, it actually took me 6 weeks to get myself out of the house and into see Philippe for the first time. And that became the beginning of life again for me.
The 6 weeks, Dorothy, sorry to interrupt, but I'm just curious because the 6 week time lapse, that was just a function of the depression, wasn't it? It just took you that long to sort of focus and energize yourself to the point where you could go do something, right?
Depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
Just to prepare myself to leave the house, to meet new people, to get into the car and drive.
So I'm curious, though. You talked about this condition of depression and reluctance to even circulate with the rest of the world. How did you go to work every day?
I hadn't worked for a number of years.
You just checked yourself out of the workforce, huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
A series of incidents. I had been working. A series of incidents happened over a 6 week period that just would have brought just about anybody to their knees, and the last one being laid off my job, and I just threw up my hands and went, okay, I surrender.
Right.
And then working with my counselor, we were trying to work through the depression that we knew I had then, and we kept on running into a brick wall. And I thought, I'm blocked somehow. Something's blocking me, and I've got to find it. And that's why I knew medications were not the route for me.
Well, I was just about to ask you. You described yourself earlier as having been prescribed antidepressants. Did they do anything for you?
They kept me in the workforce for a number of years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I'm grateful that I had them for the period of time and the relief it gave me, but there was more to it.
So you said you were at a point, literally at a fork in the road, where either you were going to check yourself into a hospital or you were going to go find some alternative method of resolving this problem. So you were it was so debilitating psychologically and physically, Dorothy, that you felt you had to go to the hospital? You were just physically that run down?
Yes.
Wow. And that's just a function of not really having a lot of energy or purpose in life, it sounds like.
Well, it was a combination, I realized later, of, as I started working with Philippe, is, at least for me, there was an underlying number of layers of trauma in my life from a very young age.
Right.
That if it's not dealt with, your mind locks it away in a closet someplace, and you put enough layers of those, one on top of the other, eventually your brain is just not going to be able to deal with it.
I understand. So, Dorothy, before you went to Philippe and he began this elaborate process of unraveling all of these events in your life so that you could eventually have them out in front of you and go, oh my gosh, look what happened, and look at and the cause and effect relationship of all of these events. When you went to other medical practitioners, was that process of determining traumatic events or regressing to find out what went off the rails many years ago, was that ever even initiated?
No, I was dismissed. Most often, I was dismissed.
And you were prescribed antidepressants.
Yeah.
And what other remedies, if any, were offered to you?
None. I took my own initiative to find an excellent counselor who worked the best that he could to help me, but he can only do so much.
And was the counselor in question a psychologist, that sort of counseling type person?
He wasn't a psychologist, but he was extremely well trained.
Right. Okay. But still, but it's a medical thing. In addition to the psychology of it all, the depression, it physically, you were about to go to the hospital, Dorothy. You were so medically challenged.
I couldn't care for myself. That's what depression, if you go deep enough into it, you get to the point where you don't dress, you don't bathe, you sit in a chair for 12 hours a day, you get up, you go sleep for 12 hours, and you get up the next morning and you sit in a chair for 12 hours.
Dorothy, what sort of support systems do you have in your life, or did you have in your life during all of this? Did you have a spouse? Do you have children, family members, a roommate, anybody close to you that you could at least kind of share what the heck was going on?
My sister knew, and she was my lifeline. And there were a few other friends who were also aware, and they felt helpless.
And the other aspect of depression and anxiety that we're trying to zoom in on the program today, Dorothy, is the mental health nature of the problem, because it's seen as there's a stigma attached to anxiety and depression. You're seen as a bit of a mental health risk. Did you encounter that in your workplace at all? Were you very reluctant to share with any of your work colleagues any of this stuff in your life?
Nobody knew.
Right.
No, nobody knew, because how do you describe something you can't see? And I don't blame people, because unless you have a context of which that someone's explaining something to you, if you have a context that you can connect to understand, then people can have empathy and compassion for you.
Right.
But when they hear my story of sitting in a chair for 12 hours and sleeping for 12 hours, nobody can connect to that. So it's very difficult for people, because you don't have a cast on your leg, or you
right.
don't have a bandage on your arm.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something foreign, because there's been such a stigma attached to what they sort of call quote-unquote illness. I think of it as I now know, the connections in my brain weren't working anymore. And once they start working, then you go back to being who you are.
And that's Philippe's whole point. The depression and the anxiety, they're always much deeper than what appears on the surface. Correct?
Correct.
Right. And in some cases, I'm curious, have you got a second to walk us through? Sonia's talked to us in previous episodes of the program about what happens to a person when they call NeuroKinetics going, for goodness sake, please help. You've been there, you've done that. Walk us through what happened to you when you called.
When I called, I was set up with an appointment, and it was explained to me that Philippe starts with a balance test. And at that point, I just said, okay. I was willing to somehow just go on pure faith that this was the road that I had to take. So
right.
When I arrived at the clinic, Philippe took me into his testing room and worked his magic. The man has a brilliant mind, and I'll let him explain to you what that's all about. But I could tell, standing in that room, my balance was off, and my body was completely and totally out of balance. And he gave me the results at the end and said to me, Dorothy, I can help you. And that's all that I needed to hear. And I started sessions with him immediately, using different techniques. I was so sensitive to touch of any sort that it took him a little while to sort through his army of needles that he uses for acupuncture.
Oh, right, of course.
Until he found what I could tolerate.
Right.
And within a couple of weeks, I had a situation that showed me just how quickly changes could be made. At that point in time, I could barely talk to a clerk without bursting into tears. And a friend of mine called me in crisis and said, Dorothy, I need help. I have nowhere else to turn. And
right.
This was a very close friend. And I thought, oh, can I help her? And as she was telling her story, I realized I'm not crying.
Mm-hmm.
I can deal with this. I can handle this. I was amazed. And I went, okay, this is really something.
And how far into the weeks of therapy and treatment with Dr. Philippe were you at that point when you realized this is working? I can actually be a benefit to other people. How far along were you?
2-3 weeks.
Wow, that is quick.
Yeah. I was expecting 2-3 months.
Yes.
Now, each person is an individual, and had that situation happened, I don't know whether I would have noticed it or been cognizant of it quite so quickly, but because it was a crisis, it showed itself that quickly.
Mm-hmm. So when you went and sought out Sonia and Philippe and the gang at NeuroKinetics Clinic, when you went there and realized pretty quickly that these people, A, were quite prepared to sit down and listen to you and put you through the assessment process and began to help you almost immediately, were you ever afraid by the time you got to NeuroKinetics? Were you afraid of what people might think about you even in this new place? Or were you so far down the road with all of that stuff, Dorothy, you were just happy to get there?
I was just happy to be there, and I sensed with Philippe he's an incredibly compassionate and empathetic man, and because of my history of trauma, he had to know. I had to tell him all the stories.
Sure.
And he was the first one who listened.
And that's a big part of it, isn't it,
yeah.
Philippe? Getting the actual life story of the individual who's come to see you. I mean, they've put themselves out. The very least you can do is hear their story, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and understanding the chronology of whatever has happened adversely is critically important as well.
Right. Now, Dorothy, how long ago did this treatment program end at NeuroKinetics?
3-4 years ago.
Oh my!
I'm horrible with dates and times. I just know that life is. I have my life back,
right.
And I know that I will never be in depression again.
And are there follow-up sessions that you need to do once a year or every 6 months or any of that stuff, or have they seen the last of you?
No, they've not seen the last of me. Because I find that once you understand how your brain works, you know when it's not functioning completely correctly. And you go in for a tune-up. It's not like they say, okay, we need to see you, Dorothy. Now, each person is an individual, so I can't speak for others. But, I mean, if I fall or I have a physical accident, one of the first phone calls I'm making is to Philippe.
Oh, okay, because of the traumatic nature. Is it possible, Philippe, while we've got Dorothy on the line, is it possible to go through the program as Dorothy has successfully done and fall back? Do you need to maintain a certain attitude and outlook and, as Dorothy says, perhaps even show up for a tune-up every now and then?
Well, it's a matter of need. It is a matter of need, and under pressure we tend to get fatigued, and out of that we may slide away a little bit from a standpoint of brain controls, if you will. So I don't want to be technical here, but in short, is under the pressures, lifestyle pressures,
sure.
Professional, occupational pressures, we tend to get fatigued and worn out once in a while, and if there is vulnerabilities, that would be where problems may begin to kick in.
Right.
So it is preventative as well as, repairing or fixing a little bit. And forgive the technicality of the word fixing here, but yes, it is that mindset. So it is on an as-needed basis exclusively.
Dorothy, only a couple of minutes left here, and we do appreciate your time and your courage in coming forward to discuss this with us. It's very kind of you. A lot of people listen to this program. This is Boomer Life. A lot of people who are 50 plus, and a lot of people who are at a point in their lives where the script isn't turning out the way I wanted it to be written, and that's really depressing. So talk to those people in terms of overcoming the fears and particularly the stigma, Dorothy, to get to where you are, to that, and I don't mean to sound facetious, but to kind of a happy place, if you don't mind my saying so.
Well, it is a happy place. And what I'd like to say to anybody out there is, it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks of you. Who's important is what you think of yourself. And if things aren't happening or going the way you want them to, then this is the time to create that life for you. You can. You just have to make that decision.
Right. And once the decision is taken, however, whatever amount of time it takes to execute the decision, in your case it was about 6 weeks, it's time well spent nonetheless, isn't it?
Oh, it's given me back the rest of my life. And I couldn't even begin to imagine. And when your body is performing at peak performance, so is your mind. Mm-hmm. And you see the possibilities, and you can take those possibilities by the throat and just run with it. Whereas if you're feeling fatigued, you're feeling tired, and you can't even think of, I can't think of going back to school.
Right.
Well, yeah, you can. And you can learn, or you can, create that garden in your backyard or travel the world. It's all there within you. All you have to do is have it unlocked again. It doesn't go away. It's still there. Mm-hmm. You just have to find a way to re-access it, and that's what Philippe does.
Wow. What a fantastic testimonial. I must say, you are a pretty impressive guest, Dorothy. Thank you so much for this. Wonderful to speak to you, and I'm so glad to hear you're doing so well.
Thank you.
My pleasure entirely. We need to take a quick break here on Boomer Life, but when we come back, we're going to ask our two guests, how did you do that? After this time out on CIL 650.
Canada's only weekly radio show dedicated to the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on CIL 650.